Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the tragic story of Thomas Craig and the murder of Thomas Henderson, which took place in Gateshead in 1910. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. It is completely free to subscribe, it doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, and this one I think is going to be quite a long one. So I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify. So I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. Thomas Craig, also known as Thomas Craig, which I believe was actually his real name, but nearly every newspaper called him Craig, so I've stuck with that one for the time being, was born in Spennymoor in Durham in around 1885 to parents Henry and Mary, and he was one of at least 3 children. Thomas had briefly worked as a miner, however he seems to have spent a lot of time either in prison or in the reformatory school, and he can be found in the reformatory school in 1897, where he was going to be kept there for 4 years, and his release date was 1901. And he was 12 years old when he was sent to the school for stealing, and this was not his first offence, and at the time he was neither able to read or write, but it does appear that he did learn to read and write while he was in the reformatory school, but not to any great standard. By 1904, he had been arrested for assault on a young girl by the name of Hannah, who was 15 years old, and for this crime he had been sentenced to 7 years penal servitude, and he was released from prison the day before the crime that we are discussing today was committed. Thomas Henderson, the victim, was born in around 1888 and was around 22 years old at the time of his death. His place of birth is unknown. His father had died, but his mother Mary was still alive. Thomas worked as a glassmaker, and he had married Annie Finn in February of 1910. Annie had previously been the girlfriend of Thomas Craig, and she had met Thomas Henderson while Thomas Craig was still in prison. Annie Henderson, the other injured party, was born in around 1887 in Barnard Castle to parents Patrick and Catherine, and was one of at least 8 children, and Annie worked as a flax spinner at the mill in Barnard Castle. Because both of the men involved in this week's story are called Thomas, I will a lot of the time just use their surnames to try to avoid any confusion. On March the 25th, Thomas Craig was released from Portland Prison, which was in Dorset, after serving the main part of his 7-year sentence. On his release, he immediately made his way to Barnard Castle, where he asked around the neighbourhood to find out where his so-called sweetheart, Annie Finn, was living, although he was aware now that she had married and was called Annie Henderson. He asked Annie's sister, but she refused to tell him where she was, although somehow he seemed to find out that she was living in Gateshead, so this was where he headed to next. And on his arrival, he managed to find Mary Henderson, who was the mother of Thomas, who told him where her son and daughter-in-law lived. When he arrived at their home in Oakwell Gate in Gateshead on March the 26th, it seemed that Annie was not really pleased to see him. A short conversation took place, and then Thomas Henderson turned his back to Craig, and almost instantly Craig took out his revolver and fired, hitting Henderson in the back. Craig then fired at Annie, and although he hit her, she did not fall to the ground. The noise of the gunshots had caused Mary to run into the kitchen to see what had happened, and Craig then ran outside. And although Henderson was injured, he ran out after him and chased him down the street. P.C. Sanderson was on duty in the area when he found Thomas Henderson, he was in the High Street, sitting on the footpath with 2 men by his side. He immediately sent for the doctor, and Thomas was carried to the police station. Dr. West was already at the Henderson's home where he had been sent for to attend to Annie, and he had sent her to the RVI, or the Royal Victoria Infirmary. Dr. West then examined Thomas at the police station. He found him to be unconscious with a gunshot wound to his back, and he died 20 minutes after the doctor's arrival. The police were aware that the man responsible for the crime was Thomas Craig, but he was nowhere to be found, and this resulted in a manhunt that would last for around 3 weeks before Thomas was eventually captured, hiding in a hayloft in a farm in Dilston in Corbridge. Prior to his arrest, the inquest was held at the Gateshead police courts. Mary Henderson said she had identified the body as being that of her only son Thomas. She said he lived in Oakwell Gate with his wife Annie. Mary said on March the 26th a man came to her house asking after Annie Henderson. She said that he had claimed to be a relative. She said she had never met him before and did not know who he was, but she told him where Annie lived and walked with him to their house. She said when they went inside, the couple were in the kitchen, so she left Craig with them and went into the bedroom. She said she did hear some of the conversation before she left the room, and she said that Craig had asked Annie why she had given him up for Henderson, and Annie had told him that it was because she loved him better. She said Henderson tried to shake hands with Craig, but he refused, and she said it was then that she left the room and she did not see what happened next. She said she had not been in the bedroom long when she heard the sound of a gunshot. She rushed back into the kitchen and saw that her son had been shot. Then she saw Craig fire the gun at Annie. She said she felt as if he was chasing her round the kitchen table. She said Craig then rushed out of the door with her injured son chasing after him, and she said she saw them both run down Oakwell Gate. She said Craig had left his cap in the house, so he would have been easily spotted in a crowd. Now this, of course, was at a time when pretty much everyone, whether you were rich or poor, would have worn a cap or a hat of some kind when they were outside, so a man not wearing one would have been quite easy to find. Annie Henderson said Thomas was her husband and they had been married since February of that year. She said she had first met Craig when she had been living in Barnard Castle in around 1902. She said she had found him to be jealous all the time, often telling her what he would do to her if he found her with another man. She said after 2 years of them being together, he was arrested for assaulting a young girl of 15 and was sentenced to 7 years penal servitude. She said he had asked her to wait for him and she had told him that she would, and she frequently wrote to him while he was in prison. However, she said in September of 1909 she met Thomas Henderson and they began spending time together, and she stopped writing to Craig. She said before they had married, her sister had written to Craig and told him of the upcoming wedding. After this, she had received several letters from Craig where he had told her he would pay money if he had to find out where she was. He said he would not let her go. She had promised to wait for him, and now she had given him up for another man. He would not put up with this. He had threatened to send her where her mother was, and Annie said that her mother was dead. She said she did not reply to any of these letters. She said after this she did not get any further letters, so she went ahead with the wedding. She said her husband did not think that Craig would really do anything, but he had always told her to keep the doors locked when he was not at home with her. She then told of the day that Craig had arrived at their home in Oakwell Gate. She said he had come into the living room with her mother-in-law and he had said to her, "You are Annie Finn." She said she told him, "I am Mrs. Henderson now." She said he asked her why she had given him up after promising to wait for him, and she told him that she loved her husband more. After this, she said her husband went to shake hands with Craig, but he refused. She said he continued standing in the room, and she said her husband then turned his back to him. She said he was about to hang a picture on the wall and was standing on a chair with a hammer in his hand, and she went to help him. She said it was as his back was turned that Craig fired the gun and shot him. She said Craig then pointed the gun at her and fired, hitting her in the chest. She said her mother-in-law had now come back into the room, and at this point Craig ran outside and her husband had chased after him. She said she did not see her husband or Craig again after this. She said that Dr. West had been sent for and that she had been taken to the RVI where a bullet had been removed from her chest. She said it had not been life-threatening and she had soon been allowed to return to her mother-in-law's house. P.C. Sanderson said he was on duty in Swinburne Street when he received information about an injured man in the High Street in Gateshead. He said when he arrived, he found Thomas Henderson sitting on the footpath. 2 men were sitting with him. It seemed they were trying to support him and he was on the verge of collapse. He said he immediately sent word for the doctor and then Thomas was carried to the police station. Dr. West said he had been called to the police station on March the 26th. He said he saw Thomas Henderson, who had a wound in his back and was unconscious. He knew at once that nothing could be done to help him, and he said that he had died around 20 minutes later. He said he had also performed the post-mortem and it was his professional opinion that death had been due to blood loss from the gunshot wound to his back. Detective Eagle said he had gone to the house in Gateshead and examined the scene of the crime. He said he had found several bullets in the wall and he later collected the bullet that had been removed from the body of Thomas Henderson. He said they were all from the same gun. As Thomas Henderson had still not been found, the coroner made inquiries as to whether or not the inquest should be adjourned. However, the police felt that no new evidence was likely to be found, and they saw no reason why the inquest could not be concluded. The coroner then spoke to the jury to state that it was clear to him that no person other than Thomas Craig was responsible for the death of Thomas Henderson, and that it was by luck that this was not a double murder or even a triple one, as both Annie and Mary Henderson could have also been shot and killed. He ended by saying that the letters sent to Annie were proof that this crime had been premeditated, and that the jury could only reach one conclusion, and that was one of guilty of wilful murder. The jury, after retiring for only a few minutes, returned a verdict of guilty of wilful murder against Thomas Craig, and he was committed for trial in his absence. The funeral of Thomas Henderson took place at Gateshead Cemetery on April the 2nd, 1910. It was said that huge crowds followed the hearse from Oakwell Gate to the cemetery. The funeral was not covered in great detail in the local papers, but it was said that many floral tributes were sent by sympathising friends. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Thomas Henderson anywhere in the cemetery. On April the 16th, acting on information received, P.C. Reid headed to Dilston Farm in Corbridge. He was met there by several officers from the Northumberland force. They had been informed that Thomas Craig was possibly hiding in a hayloft in the farm, and it was hoped that this was true, as he had been incredibly difficult to find. A reward had even been offered of £50 for anyone given information that would lead to his capture. And it had been thought that after his escape from the Henderson house that Thomas Craig had headed towards the Swing Bridge, and it was thought that here he had bought himself a cap to help him blend into the crowd, and that he had then gone into Newcastle. From there, although they had been given the occasional news of a sighting, he had been impossible to find. And in Corbridge it had been known that someone had been breaking into homes, stealing money and food, and the description fitted Thomas Craig, so everyone hoped that the man in the hayloft was him. 2 policemen went into the loft, and luckily for them, the man they found was Thomas Craig. He was asleep when they first entered, so they were able to grab hold of him before he completely awoke. He did resist slightly, but they were quickly able to bring him outside. He was then arrested for the wilful murder of Thomas Henderson, to which he replied that he had not meant to kill him, he had meant to kill Annie, and he also said that he had planned to kill Mr. Justice Darling, but he had not been able to find out where he lived. Mr. Justice Darling had been the judge who had sent him to prison for the assault in 1904. Thomas was then taken to Gateshead Police Station. The reward money, for anyone interested, was later shared by several people who had all given details of the whereabouts of Thomas Craig. The trial took place in June of 1910 before Mr. Justice Grantham. Thomas Craig pleaded not guilty to the charge, and as is often the case, the majority of the evidence given at the trial is the same as at the inquest, so I will, as always, only include the new information. The prosecution stated in their opening statement that on March 26, before visiting the Hendersons, Thomas Craig had gone to Newcastle, where he had purchased a revolver and 50 cartridges. Thomas Simpson said he worked for a W.R. Pape, gunsmiths of Newcastle. He said on March 26 he had sold a revolver and cartridges to a man who he now knew to be Thomas Craig. He said at the time the man had given his name as John Wilson of Durham, but the prisoner was the same man. P.C. Reid said that when they had arrested Craig in Corbridge, he still had the loaded gun in his pocket. He also had 2 letters from Annie Henderson and 2 photos that to him appeared to be of Annie as well. And when he was arrested, P.C. Reid said he told him, "I am not guilty of any intention to kill the man. I did not intend to kill him. I only intended to wing him. I meant to kill Annie and then myself. But I did not take my own life, as I did not see Annie fall after I had shot her." Winifred Finn said Annie was her sister. She said several years ago she had been keeping company with Craig, and when he was sent to prison she said Annie had written to him several times. She believed that this continued until Annie met Henderson. She said Annie and Henderson had been married in February of 1910, and after their marriage they had gone to live at Gateshead. She said that on March the 25th, Craig visited her home and asked her for Annie's address. She said she refused to tell him where her sister lived. Craig had told her that if Annie refused to speak to him, she would have to face the consequences, and that if he met Henderson first, then she would have no husband to go home to. Winifred said she tried to reason with him, and when he left her, he told her, "I don't think I will do anything, Winnie." Thomas Priestman said he had met Craig in Crook on the 26th of March. He said he'd been asking about the Hendersons, and a man who was with him at the time had told Craig that they lived in Gateshead. Priestman said Craig told him, "If I had known the game that was going on with Henderson and Annie, I would have twisted his neck." He said after this, Craig left to go to Gateshead. William Tate of Gateshead said he met Craig on March the 26th, and that he had also asked him if he knew where the Hendersons lived. He said he had given him directions to the home of Mary Henderson, the mother of Thomas. Henry Craig said Thomas was his son, and he simply stated that his wife had not been of sound mind at the time she had given birth to his son, though it really isn't very clear as to what this statement was meant to prove. The defence spoke to the jury, suggesting that this should be a case of manslaughter. He said that to a weak mind like that of Thomas Craig, Annie giving him up for another man would be great provocation indeed. The defence stated that it was clear from the evidence given that from the moment he had been released from prison, Thomas Craig had intended to find Annie and take her life. He had even written her letters warning her that she would end up like her mother. This, he said, was a premeditated murder. The judge, in summing up, said it was not right for someone to take the life of another simply because he had been jilted, nor was it right to threaten the life of a judge simply because he had been given a long sentence for what at the time was another terrible crime that he had committed. And he could not see any evidence to suggest that Thomas Craig was not the same as everyone else and had known exactly what he was doing at the time the crime was committed. And while he may have intended to kill Annie, he had killed Thomas Henderson. The jury retired for almost 1 hour before returning a verdict of guilty of wilful murder against Thomas Craig, but with a strong recommendation to mercy. Thomas was asked if he had anything to say, to which he replied, "I have nothing to add. I am quite prepared for death." The judge, now wearing the black cap, then spoke to Thomas, telling him that he would be sentenced to death by hanging and that his remains would be buried within the grounds of Durham Prison. He added that the recommendation of the jury would be passed to the relevant authorities, but he did not hold out much hope in this case. During his time in Durham Prison, Thomas was attended by the Reverend Canon Brown, and it was said that he paid close attention to his readings, and his friends in Spennymoor had arranged a petition for his reprieve, and this had been signed by some 5,000 people, and had been sent to the Home Secretary. But a letter was received a short time later, stating that no reason could be found to commute the sentence to one of penal servitude, and that the execution would go ahead as planned on July the 12th, 1910, when Thomas would be the 34th prisoner to be executed within the prison. I did not find any details of any family members who had visited Thomas during his time in prison. The night before the execution, Thomas was said to have spent a quiet night. He slept well and arose at 7 a.m, where he was again visited by the Reverend Canon Brown, who would remain with him until the end. The executioner was Pierpoint. Now I have to say at this point I do not know which one of the brothers this may have been. General opinion is that it was Henry Pierpoint, and if this was the case, then this may have been one of his last duties as a hangman, as he was dismissed from the duty sometime in July of 1910 for drunken behaviour at an execution. Anyway, moving on. Thomas was pinioned, which means that his arms would be tied at the wrist, sometimes behind the back and sometimes in front, and in this case it was behind his back. He was then led to the gallows. Craig walked firmly to the scaffold. It was said at the time that he had a rather unkempt appearance, as he had not shaved for some time. But, however, he was still quite in control of everything that he did that morning, and he stepped firmly onto the drop, and Pierpoint and his assistant adjusted the rope and placed the white cap over Thomas's head. He did not make any final statement. The signal was given and the bolt was removed and Thomas fell. His death was said to be as near as possible to instant. In older cases, this would be when the black flag would be raised to let the people know that the execution had taken place. However, on this occasion, only the sound of the bell tolling could be heard by the large crowd that had gathered outside of the prison to let them know that the execution had taken place. After the usual time of 1 hour, Thomas's body was removed and placed into a plain and simple coffin, and he was later buried within the grounds of Durham Prison. After the burial, the area would usually be rolled to hide all evidence that a burial had taken place. No markers were left, and only the prison records would reveal where the body had been placed. Now you may think that this would be the end of the story, but it's not quite, as a short time after the execution, Thomas Simpson found himself in court for having illegally sold the revolver to Thomas Craig. It would seem that a new gun law that had come into effect in 1903 had not been followed correctly. However, it seems that the law had been a little confusing, and the defence for Thomas Simpson stated that he had simply acted as he had always done when selling a revolver and did not realise that he had done anything wrong. And the magistrates seemed to accept this, and Thomas was fined 5 shillings and costs for selling the gun. And, as if this last bit wasn't enough, probably the most bizarre part of the story was that in August of 1910, Henry Craig, the father of Thomas, went to court to apply for possession of the revolver that had been used in the murder of Thomas Henderson. The magistrates told Henry that he could not apply for this on behalf of his son, but Henry insisted that he was doing this because his son had left him the gun in his will. He then produced a newspaper where some mention of the gun had been made, and he was told by the magistrates that this was not evidence enough. He then stated that his son had written him a letter. He handed this letter to the magistrates, but again they told them that this was not enough evidence. Henry was then told that he could not have the revolver, And his reply to this was, "Can I have the revolver?" To which he was told, "You will never get it. Do you understand what that means?" He was then asked to leave the court. Annie Henderson could later be found living with her sister Winifred in Barnard Castle, and it would seem that she may well have been pregnant at the time of her husband's death, as in 1911 she had a daughter living with her who was 5.5 months old. I do not know what happened to the family after this. This was a very tragic case. I felt that Thomas Craig was someone who was going to spend most of his life in prison, as from an early age he was already in trouble with the police on numerous occasions, and had not been out of the reform school long when he had committed the assault on the young 15-year-old girl in Barnard Castle, resulting in his 7-year prison term. Annie had also said that he was the jealous type, and it seems that when she met someone better, she simply stopped all contact with Craig, but he clearly was not the type to accept this, and acted in a most strange manner, enough to suggest that he was insane with jealousy, sending her several letters threatening her life. And this led him to make every effort to find Annie on his release from prison, with the sole intention of killing her. Sadly for Thomas Henderson, he was the one who suffered with the loss of his life because of Craig's insane jealousy. Would Thomas Henderson even have allowed Craig to enter his home had he known that he had a gun with him? And would he have warned his mother not to tell anyone where they lived if someone strange came looking for Annie, if he had known what Craig might do? I think if either Thomas or Annie Henderson had really believed that Craig would carry out his threat to kill Annie, then they would have made every effort to make sure that he could not find them. Was the jury right to find Thomas Craig guilty of murder? Well, I think that they were, as he had made clear threats by letter to Annie, and also to some of the people he had spoken to on the day of the crime, so this truly was premeditated. I also believe that it was correct that he was not given a reprieve, as based on his past history, I am sure that had he been later released from prison, he would have again attempted to kill Annie. I don't believe that, even though he was perhaps, as I've already stated, was perhaps suffering from some kind of insanity because of jealousy, I don't believe that this was enough to have allowed him to have been given a sentence of life imprisonment. I think hanging was the best answer. But what do you think? Do you think Thomas Craig was the kind of person who would have spent his life in and out of prison? Do you think he was insane with jealousy when he committed the crime? Or do you think he was simply seeking revenge for the loss of his so-called sweetheart? Do you think that it was possible that, although he said that he did not intend to kill Thomas Henderson, that he actually did, as it seems strange that Thomas Henderson was the first person that he shot at? Do you think the jury was right to find him guilty, and that his death by hanging was the only way that this tragic story would finally end? And finally, can you think of any sane reason why his father would have wanted to claim the revolver that had been used in the murder? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching. I am sorry that I did make a couple of little mistakes, but I think that considering how long this video is, I don't think I've made all that many, so I am actually quite pleased with myself. I don't know, but there you go. Anyway, I do hope to see you all again very soon.